afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon to our panel of guests and everyone that is joining us online today. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Mpumelelo Mhlongo. I am a programs officer for Soul City Institute, and I am an activist for social justice, striving for equality, especially when we're talking young women and children. So today we are discussing statutory rape in the context of teenage pregnancy, of course. So often the media reports teenage pregnancy generally, and they hardly give a breakdown of teenagers who are pregnant, rather, and who are under the age of 16 years who have fallen pregnant. So such general reporting, it places on a spotlight on the pregnant teenagers, and somehow it puts the blame on them. So today we will discuss this and we will unpack this more during this webinar. I'd like to especially welcome our guests in our panel. And before I introduce the panel members to discuss this topic, feel free to post your questions and use the hashtag Day of the Girl or hashtag IDG 2020. So today we are commemorating the International Day of the Girl, which is the 11th of October 2022. So to introduce our panel today, we have Sihlali or Gugulethu Sihlali, who is the UNFPA Youth Advisory Panel member. And we also have Mthetho Tshemese, who is a clinical psychologist. And we also have Andiswa Gebashe, who is the sign language interpreter and the South African language activist. Unfortunately, we were supposed to also have Dr. Nozuko Mkabayi, who is the CEO from Rahima Moosa Mother and Child Hospital. Unfortunately, she could not join us due to urgent matters. I know she was also on the poster that was circulating. Unfortunately, we won't be having her join us. Also, I'd like to appreciate Upal Mbolekwa, who is our sign language interpreter. Welcome, everyone, to this wonderful webinar. So I will just cut through the chase because of time. I will start with you, Gugu. Gugu, do you prefer if I call you Gugulethu or Gugu?
I'm happy with anyone that you prefer.
Wonderful. So I will start with you, Gugu. Can you please tell us more about this day and why is it significant?
Okay. Good afternoon to all the honorable human beings in the glory of their chosen identities. I am Gugulethu Sihlali. I am passionate about the discourse of women and children, and I am a sexual and reproductive health rights advocate. So for me today, I think this day is particularly important because of the recognition and acknowledgement of the girl child being a human being. I think often than not, we disregard the fact that everyone is a human being before their chosen identity. And I think that's where the structural disadvantages and a lot of the issues that the girl child will face come from, because of the not acknowledgement of the fact that they are human beings, whereas the boy child is afforded that. Oftentimes they're afforded grace to make mistakes, they're afforded grace to be privileged and, associated with power. So I think that's the first thing, just the recognition and acknowledgement of the girl child. And then secondly, I think it's the acknowledgement and the recognition of the structural disadvantages that the girl child experiences on a daily basis. So an intersectional approach would obviously go in depth and analyze that the girl child, based on their different intersecting identities, would experience these structural disadvantages differently. But on a more holistic level, I think this day just looks at the girl child and sort of the disadvantages that they experience on a daily basis, because of structural advantages, either from a patriarchal system, from institutions, and or just structurally because of different legacies. But then lastly, I think also it's a very significantly important day because it also highlights sort of the process of the starting of the distribution of power. So when we speak about vulnerabilities, particularly of a girl child, we need to acknowledge that these vulnerabilities come because of a lack of power that is afforded through them, whether through education, whether through knowing their bodies better. But this day signifies the process of that has been taken in the past 10 years to afford more girl children power, and the process that will continue to afford these girl children power in future. So I think it's a very significant and important day, and I hope we could commemorate the day even more, particularly in the corporate space, because these are the institutions that sort of cultivate or perpetuate the structural disadvantages that girl children experience.
Thank you, Gugu. Very profound statement that we acknowledge that we are all human beings before our given identity. I like that. Um, to commemorate this day as South Africa, you've just said a mouthful, but also we choose to focus on statutory rape, which is today's discussion in the context of teenage pregnancy. I'd like to bring you in, Mthetho, on this one. Please explain to someone who maybe is hearing of this word for the very first time, what is statutory rape?
Good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon to the viewers who are watching, and thank you to Soul City Institute for inviting me. In simple terms, I'm not a lawyer, even though my name is Mthetho. I'm a psychologist, as you have mentioned. But in simple terms, age 16 here in South Africa is considered, the age in which a person can consent. So in the context of girls, as we are commemorating International Day of a Girl, you may have sex that is not where there is no violence, physical violence, where you can claim and say, oh no, I had sex with this person, and then this person is a young girl who's under age of 16. So in terms of the law, a person who's below age of 16 cannot consent. So it would be considered statutory rape. So that considers like the functionality and the fact that, the development of a young girl at 16, she cannot be in a position to make an informed decision without you taking advantage of her. Like Sis Gugu mentioned, that often than not, especially in sexual relations, as we have seen in South Africa, a lot of young girls find themselves being pregnant and impregnated by older men, and even at times infected with HIV because of, they have sex with older men and they cannot negotiate the power dynamic. So the most important thing in relation to the conversation is to know that in South Africa, the age of consent is 16, and therefore if you have sex with a girl that is under 16 years of age, that would be considered statutory rape. So you are breaking the law.
Yeah, interesting. So a few weeks ago, we did an infographic or a visual presentation on statutory rape, and a number of men, they came out to be defensive, saying things like girls consent to sleeping with them, that they don't force themselves on them. So can someone under the age of 16 consent to sex?
Well, like I said, legally, no. So there's clarity in that, but also psychologically. I mean, for me, I consider, I'm a father to a girl who's 18. I consider even age 16 to be somewhat, considering the implications of sex and sexual activity. If you think about, pregnancy, if you think about STIs and how it impacts on the lives of girls, I consider 16 to be quite a young age. I would have thought that because we know psychologically that, until you are around age 25, your mind is not fully, your brain is not fully developed. So the answer is legally no, but also in terms of power relations, a girl of 16 cannot make an informed decision. And usually this takes place in a context where it's an older man. I just want to mention something, Sis Mpumi Uguti. As men, as far as I can remember, older men have tended to take advantage of girls. If you consider ukutwala, the whole idea of ukutwala, it's a culturally sanctioned, it's a traditionally sanctioned and acceptable way in which two families can decide without the girl being a part of that discussion that Mthetho is going to marry this girl without the girl even being part of that equation. So part of the difficulty that you're going to have with men seeing a problem with having sex with a 16-year-old is because culturally and traditionally, this is something that has tended to be acceptable, number one. And secondly, even the language that we use. I mean, when I was getting invited to be a part of this webinar, one of the things I said to the person who invited me is that I feel that even when we categorize rape, it's almost like we are making it as a better kind of a rape, so to speak. I mean, rape is rape. You know what I mean? So the minute you start to like preamble it and say statutory rape, it feels to me that that's also when we make it not seem like it is rape, number one, in terms of the language and the power of the language. And secondly, how it is reported in the media, it's usually reported as teenage pregnancy, when in fact, you know, these teenage girls are not impregnating themselves. You know what I mean? And then lastly, I mean, this is so sad. I mean, for someone who comes from Tanzania Township, I come from Tanzania Township, and I was reading about a month ago that about 90,000, more than 90,000 young girls in the past year were impregnated, and the youngest of those girls was 10 years old and was a Cecilia Makiwane and gave birth to a child. So surely there is a huge problem in this country about rape in general, but specifically what we call teenage pregnancy. I think we need to do better in terms of how we talk about it. We need to do better in terms of how we report it. And my view is that there is no better rape, so to speak. So the minute you want to categorize these rapes, it's almost like you are taking away the viciousness and the violence that actually visits the bodies of these young girls.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. You know, interestingly, a lot of cases have been quoted as, or called, the numbers called pregnant teenagers when there's a lot to it. So thank you even for mentioning that these fancy names, I'm using the word fancy deliberately because for some, a young girl from Gqeberha or Nkomazi in Mpumalanga, where I come from, they would not understand the word, even what statutory rape means. And you find that these are big words that are even used in the court of law. And perpetrators get to go away, walk away with, crimes because of these big and fancy names that are not necessarily explained in depth to the victims. Andiswa, so for the deaf community, how big is this of a problem? So give us a picture. Like oftentimes when we have these discussions, we forget about, people with disabilities. And so how is it if this is a case of a deaf person?
Hi, hello everybody, and once again, thank you for this opportunity. Whew, again, I don't speak for deaf people. I happen to work from the language, and I do a lot of community service. I get to accompany a lot of young girls and women and mothers who are deaf. Some to these cases, and they do so with failure. So the biggest problem communication. I'm not sure if you can hear me because
Yes,
everybody
yes, I
seems
can
to
hear
be
you.
going off on my end. You can hear me, okay?
I can hear you now.
So the perfectly. Okay, so the biggest problem is communication and what we call hearing. You and I have a hearing privilege. We get to hear information like this information. And ordinarily, there wouldn't be access for a deaf person. So sadly, and this was on the news in recent schools. So a deaf child would go to a school And the hearing teacher would take advantage in the disguise of, I'm teaching you what the real world is like. And they will molest these young girls, they will rape these young girls. And these girls have nowhere to go. They have no way of getting aid because even the information to them is very limited in them accessing information in where they get help. Most of them are not even aware that this is rape, as much as anyone else in maybe in my village, Mzimkulu, might not know that if a Babu Sbiya is sleeping with me and I'm 16 and younger, that is rape. It's even worse in the deaf community where the means of communication is sign language. We get to interpret these cases on a daily. And even because just the teenage pregnancy itself, some some young girls are forced into abortion because they are being told this is the right thing to do. And because you and I have put ourselves in a hearing privilege and a privilege where there's power relation that Mthetho was talking about. Because I'm hearing, I know better, I have more information. And because a deaf young girl is not aware of most of these things because they don't get to access information really like you and I, they think that Babu Sbia is doing them a favor. A Mamu Gebashe, if Mama Gebashe is saying, you need to abort this, and so many things get to happen in their bodies without their permission because they are being told it's the rite of passage. We are teaching you how things are done. So it is really, really bad. There isn't a word to equate how dire the situation is.
Yeah, thank you. So, just a follow-up question. Do these girls experience challenges when reporting these violations? Say from the uh, justice system or other, places where they can report this?
Yes. They experience by telling family members or teachers or when they get to the police station, because then they have to explain what happened in a language that nobody understands. If they do have an interpreter, if they are lucky to have an interpreter, or they are lucky to express it in writing, the society looks at them that, but you're deaf. What do you know about sex? Are you sure this really happened to you? And some might not even have the correct terminology to explain what transpired to them because they've been told this is, we are teaching you womanhood. Now that you're a teenager, you're going to grow into being a woman. These are the things that you need to learn. These are the things that are being done.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to come to Mthetho again, but just before that, I want to check that are we winning in terms of helping the young girls who are, with disabilities? Are we getting there, or it's still so close yet so far type of a situation in terms of having these cases reported? Do we see prosecutions happening? Do we see perpetrators being incarcerated? What's the current stance? Hello, Andiswa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
So we we are so, there is some work that is being done. For example, us talking, some law enforcement willingness to listen. And it sounds as if it's a favor being done more than a right of being protected or a right of being heard. we are very, very far, not anywhere near, but there is some strive that's happening in some areas or not, because most of the time it's a ticking box exercise. And when we speak of sign language, the language, and for people to express themselves, we jump into disabilities, and it gets mumbled in that big umbrella, because for a deaf girl, it's more than just the deafness, the disability. It's a language factor. It's the fact that there isn't a language that they use is going to be understood when they go and report, when they have to seek a social worker, when they have to seek whatever form of help. The language barrier becomes the biggest key, where they are unable to, we are moving to GBV very soon, and everybody's going to know, no, we have accessibility, and it's just ticking a box, and we're not doing practically on the ground. And even if we're getting a social worker, interpreters to come and volunteer, anyone to come and say, okay, I'm here. And there's the issue of privacy as well. There's the issue of embarrassment, because you're thinking you've done something wrong as a little girl. Anybody who has experienced abuse under the age of 16 knows very well that you blame yourself, number one, and you feel it was your fault that this older man came up to you and did what he did, yet it's not your fault.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Andiswa. And Mthetho, do you think men know that having sex with a girl under the age of 16 years is rape, even if she does give consent? Or maybe they know, it's just that they know that they can get away with it.
It's a difficult one to speak on behalf of men who actually are perpetrators of statutory rape or rape,
Yeah.
and say why they do it. All I can tell you is, if one just looks at how we are raised as boys, in the main, the way in which we are raised in relation to girls, there isn't much emphasis to us as boys respecting girls, number one, as human beings. Like we started this conversation, look, where you recognize a girl as a fully fledged human being who's worthy of respect, who enjoys or who should enjoy the same human rights as me as a boy. We don't think of girls in that way. We think of girls as, when I'm thinking how, I'm not that young anymore, but generally the way in which boys are raised in relation to girls, the general sense is that of girls being seen at best as a nuisance to us playing as boys. We don't want to play with them. Don't cry like a girl. And within that, unfortunately, there is inconsistency even in our families, how you raise a boy child in relation to a girl child. A girl child is usually raised to have good manners, to dress well, to be desirable, because one day she's going to do what? She's going to get married and change her name into a surname of a man that she's going to marry. There is no sense of independence, like as a fully fledged human being who's worthy of being respected, whose body is autonomous, etc., etc. And you see this even in teenagers, when you think about how we develop as teenagers, how we think and talk about sex and sexuality. Those of us who are heterosexual, I work with men and boys, and I often ask Amachita to just talk about, to share how we talk about sex with girls or with women. It's usually something we do on their bodies.
Yeah.
I can't even use the language we use because it's so violent, right? It's so rude. It's when we think about sex, we also don't think about sex in relation to pleasing your partner. So I'm using where there's supposed to be love and consent to show you that even within that, the kind of language and the kind of upbringing that we are socialized into being is that of not even considering pleasing your sexual partner who happens to be a woman. Let's say if you're heterosexual, let's say you are married, right? So now imagine that's the scenario that we are raised in now versus when a person doesn't care about your well-being. So there's a whole lot of stuff that we need to do in terms of how boys are raised, how men are socialized in our own families, but also there's a lot of unhealthy habits that we inherit from our old uncles, from our older brothers, from our fathers, in relation to what would have become a dominant culture, so to speak. So I know this is sounding ridiculous, but that's actually the norm. I'm sorry to tell you that is the norm. That is how rape culture finds expression in us. Like this country, as an example, think about this. This country is considered to be the best when it comes to the constitution, right? We have the best constitution, but we're number one in rape. We're number one in femicide, right? 5 times more than the global average. You need to ask yourself what is happening. And I mean, if you think about rape in general, women who are raped, they are raped in the main by people they trust and know. So there's a whole lot of psyche that is not okay about South Africa. So if now you take that as a general sense of where the country is at, and I'm not making this up, I mean, these are the numbers that in fact are reported. And we do know that a lot of women do not report the rape cases because of how the justice system is. So can you now imagine a girl who does not have power to defend herself, who does not have a voice? Can you imagine if that girl can't even access justice? Because I mean, how many psychologists, for instance, can sign? How many social workers can sign? How many police can sign? So these then becomes barriers of access for services for victims of rape. So I know I'm painting a gloomy picture. Unfortunately, that's just how it is. I mean, if you just listen to the language that we use as men to describe consensual sex and to reflect on how we have had sex, it speaks to the violence that is embedded in our culture. So the answer is, I think men who target young girls, they do that deliberately, knowing exactly what it is that they are doing. I wouldn't say that no, they don't know. No, they actually know what they are doing. They are taking advantage of people who cannot challenge them. They are taking advantage of their vulnerability at times. So I'm answering in a cautious yet sad way, because the reality is that older men in this country are taking advantage of young girls anyway.
Yeah. Which brings me to my next question. You mentioned that you work with boys and men, and I know you've touched a bit of even on the rape culture. But in your opinion, maybe as a psychologist, but also as a man who's assessing the behavior of other men and boys, why is the rape culture so pervasive?
Because it's the norm.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
because it's the norm. Like I'm talking here. Like I'm also an artist, and my name is Mthetho, which means law, right? So I suppose my family were expecting that I'll be a law-abiding citizen, But my stage name is called Indlobongela, which means, Ubundlobongela is violence. And I think there came a point in my life where I also recognized that actually the men that I was raised to become by the streets of Tanzania. And again, this is interesting. I come from a very good family background in terms of upbringing. I grew up in a very religious family background, very cultured background. But what mattered for me the most was being accepted outside in the streets by my peers, being seen to be clever, being acknowledged as a real Mjika. And unfortunately, the expectations that come with that, often than not, are that if you are compassionate, if you are caring and you are kind, and you are the one to avoid conflict, you don't like to fight, you're not seen as a real man. Violence, unfortunately, is seen as the only, in fact, aggression and anger. They are seen as expressions of masculinity, so to speak. So anything, therefore, that resembles being aggressive and being non-caring and not showing emotions and not showing vulnerability is seen in a positive light. I can speak for me. I'm doing the work that I do with the young boys and men that I work with to share with them that actually you can choose the men that you want to be, and hold on to the goodness that you may have inside of you that may not necessarily be what is shared by the street. So even as an artist, I try and use my music to highlight some of the problems. I mean, my first song called Inyala, which is Abomination, it actually speaks about rape, you know what I mean? But what I can tell you, until we engage boys, until we have a different system in our homes, until we have a different system in schools, wherein boys are nurtured in such a way that they are raised to be compassionate, kind people, kind human beings who actually make it their business to protect the rights of other people, including girls. So there's a lot of generational work that unfortunately we cannot do. I've worked for feminist organizations, and I used to tell them that don't spend too much time working with men like myself. I mean, because most of us, the psychological blueprint is like, if we are houses, our foundation is that of violence, unfortunately, especially in relation to even ourselves, even to other men, even to women, even to girls. So we need to have a movement of raising boys differently, completely different to what we're seeing now. Raise them to be compassionate, raise them to stand up and say no when their friends are actually abusing girls. But that also has to happen in our own families. And we all know on this panel that as much as we may talk here and talk human rights, when you go home, you may not even have a rank simply because you are a woman. It doesn't matter that you do this work that you do. So we need to create a new culture of boys that will end up being compassionate human beings. So to answer you, why is it so pervasive, the rape culture, is because unfortunately it's the norm. Think about what I said earlier on. Why would a country that is said to have the best constitution in the world, why would that country be number one in rape? Why would that country be number one in femicide? Surely something is not right in terms of the environment and the institutions that are raising us to be the men that we are becoming. So there's a lot of work we need to do to undo, this culture of rape, but it's not going to be done only by NGOs. I mean, it's going to have to be done in our communities, by churches. Unfortunately, as it stands right now, most of the community organizations that we have, they have, as much as you can think of our families as spaces that must protect us and the most vulnerable members of the community, of the family, that's also where a lot of the rape is happening. If you think about churches as spaces where we should pray when we're vulnerable and seek spiritual, refuge, unfortunately, some of the very same churches are the ones that are perpetuating this rape culture. So unfortunately, even the music, unfortunately, even the movies and what we consume, the entertainment. So I'm afraid to say that Soul City has a long way to go. I mean, and organizations that are actually working on changing the behavior and the identity of our masculinity. I mean, there's a lot of work that is being done in South Africa right now around what we call positive masculinity. But the reality, that is not being made to be cool enough and to be the norm. So we need to do a lot of overhaul of how we raise boys in this country, because currently the norm, unfortunately, is that the rape culture remains so pervasive. And there's no legal recourse. For those people who report the cases, unfortunately, there's no legal recourse. I mean, so people are better off not to even report the cases. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that is a known fact. there are a lot of victims who are sitting at home because they're thinking, what's the point? Even if I report, I'll experience second victimization because they'll be asking and calling the other constable and Manban. But I am hoping that someday we will have a webinar of this nature and we'll only be talking about the positives, like you mentioned in positive masculinity. And I have a question from Nomusa. So please remember, those of us who are joining us, we'll take a round of questions now. But remember to continue sending in those questions using the hashtag Day of the Girl, hashtag IDG 2022. So the first question is from Nomusa Sasa Shumang. Nomusa is asking, how do we as parents to girl children, make sure that we teach them from a young age about rape? And how do we make sure that our daughters can be open enough and trust us to tell us anything they are facing? I know they're going through a lot and it's not easy. So for a young girl, maybe I can ask or throw the question to you, Gugu.
Okay, so I think we have, in an essence, largely added a lot of complexities to sexual education. And I think as a Black community, this comes from just building up the power that we give men in a sexual context. We make sex a shameful experience, just holistically, and then mostly for the woman or the girl. So I think firstly, it is important, and I think that the conceptual work on consent is very complex in and of itself. For instance, people don't understand that consent can be revoked. People don't understand that when you start sexual intercourse with someone and you're using a condom, if the man takes it off, it's sleeving, which is considered rape. There's a lot of conceptual work on consent that a lot of people just don't understand, because just in our general lives, from like a very basic level, we were stripped off of the understanding of the fact that we are human beings who are worthy of saying yes. And this applies to both men and women, particularly in context to a Black community. So I think as a parent, the easiest way to go about it is from a very young age, already teaching your kids that if they set a boundary that they do not want to be touched, then they should not be touched. Even if it's from the parents that wants to touch the child or kiss the child, if the child does not want to be touched or kissed, even at the young age of a 6-month-old child or a 1-year-old child, they should be afforded that privilege of being respected because they've set a decision and a boundary. And I think from there onwards, then it's a lot more easier to build on the understanding of what consent is and what rape would be then, because we've already set the foundational teachings of what consent is. Then I think on a second leg, and most importantly, I think we need to empower girl children by teaching them about their bodies. Oftentimes, we don't teach girls about their bodies. All they know is that they're menstruating and this blood is coming from wherever it's coming from. They don't know how their actual biology is. So you'll find, for instance, the reference of a vagina will be incorrect at times. And I know this is very tedious, it may seem, but I think people understanding their body better gives them that power over their bodies to make better decisions over their bodies. If I understand what my body can do and what my body cannot do, I can better understand the specific desires that I want for my body and the desires that I don't want for my body. And in that way, we are better able to teach our kids the lesson on what it is that they don't want, so that when the uncle who is a rapist in the family comes to touch your child stands in a position of power to say no. And even if that power is broken, they are better able to have the conversation with you because they are equipped with the language. So I think those are very important things. But I really do think you can start teaching your child comprehensive sexual education from a very young age at a simplistic level, and then build it on foundationally from there onwards.
Thank you. Another question is from Karabo Lififi. Karabo is asking, how do we help people who are being forced to have sex with their partners without their consent? And they end up having sex, obviously, not because they want to, but because of the sake of not being told that they're not loyal and stuff. And this would obviously happen several times where you find that if you don't consent or if you don't want to engage in a sexual relationship with your partner, you are considered unfaithful or you are, dating outside of the relationship, anything like that. How can we help such people, Andiswa? If I can ask Andiswa this question to assist. Andiswa, are you still there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I am. I'm not sure if it is my line, but I could hardly pick up what you're saying. Could you please repeat the question for me?
Okay, we have a question here from Karaboli Fifi. He or she is asking, how do we help people who are being forced to have sex with their partners without, consenting to having sex, and also with the fear that if they don't want to have sex with their partner, they would be considered unfaithful or unloyal to them, and obviously this would be happening, not once but several times.
It's a difficult one. Um, it's really like Mthetho was saying, and Sis Gugu was saying, it really comes across as a gloomy picture, but it is as gloomy as it sounds, and it is as bad as it sounds, because society has made it okay for a sipho to just whenever usipho episungamo efuna ukureleasa that he can do so to a lady, or to a girl. Um, and we can go back to educating ourselves, educating our children, educating ourselves as Badala as well. I still haven't reported my incident where a partner forced himself on me and I was married. And I still haven't reported that. And with all the knowledge that I have. And again, it's what's the point? If I'm to talk, who is going to listen? And what's going to happen in any case? So it is very tricky to educate in terms of do this and do this when the system itself doesn't always allow for someone that it has happened to come out and say, Mandla did A and B and C and D. I did not give permission. So it's going to really take us to talk more, to go out in the field, do the work, singapheli mandla. One day we might wake up 10 years later, 20 years later, where we're saying we have achieved. Where Soul City can say, yes, this is the 10 years ago, these were the stage of people being sexually abused, be it teenage pregnancy or it's people in partnership and you do not give consent, and we say we have decreased the percentage. But as it is today, it is really dire because some of these things are being done by our leaders. Some of these things are being done by family members, trusted colleagues, trusted friends. So where do we go? Because at the same time, we live with the umuntu ngabantu. We live in a society. So trying to find that balance, it would really need us to talk more, to work more, to lend a hand to umakhelwane a woman that you're coming across, until we get to a point where the percentage has decreased, until we get to a point where people are being prosecuted, until we see justice working with us.
Yeah, we learn more, we talk more, and we lend a hand. Thank you. Sis Gogo, what should happen when a 14-year-old is pregnant? And how should we even be responding to this as, say, we young people? We young people, right? So how can we respond to this? What would be your immediate response if you were to approach a 14-year-old who's pregnant?
I think firstly sensitivity. I think oftentimes where women have been abused or disadvantaged furthermore by the system, there's a great expectation for them to, even in that moment, be transformational and provide recourse, which I think is a big unfair burden, which, because you've been abused and something has been taken away from you in that very instance, your first thought is not to build recourse for the next person. And I don't say this in an aspect to say that women should not be building recourse for the next woman, but I say this because we need to protect victims, which I think we have a big issue on, that we don't protect victims. So I think if a 14-year-old is coming up to me to tell me about this, the first thing would be sensitivity, and then would be to go about to take them to a healthcare institution. I think that's the first case. And then only later, after the understanding of what is happening, then a conversation can happen, just to understand deeply. I think the conversation happens after all this process, because you are, or what's most important is to create a safe space for this 14-year-old that has been abused or violated. Once the safe space has been created, it's easier to get through to the 14-year-old to understand. And obviously, from the position that I sit, the first thing that I'm thinking of a 14-year-old is pregnant is sort of what violation happened or who violated this 14-year-old, and then a conversation can be taken from there onwards. But I also do think it is important that we respect the decision that the 14-year-old would want to take. I know it seems a premature decision because the 14-year-old does not sit in a position of power, of understanding sort of that they could get the recourse that they want. But I think it's a very difficult thing to expect that victims must go march in the police station immediately, particularly in the context of how the South African recourse system, Mthetho speaks about that, and how the legal recourse is absolutely diminishing of the person that's been violated. So for me, I think I would look at it like that. But then on the second level, I think it is important that we do follow due procedures. So once we've gone to the hospital, then it is important that we do go report to the police station, and then follow proper procedures. But I do think even in the moment, it would be important to ensure that you better equip this 14-year-old to be in a better position of power if they were to be in the same position going forward. So despite creating the safe space, following processes, also just tell them and affirm to them that they are worthy of being recognized by the legal system. They are worthy of being recognized from their violation, and that life, I mean, we do say life doesn't end after violation. We do say it a lot. And I know it feels unbelievable for the victim, but just a constant affirmation from our side to the victim continuously.
Sure. Thank you. But Mthetho, what obligation do health workers, families, teachers have or would have, since we're speaking of a 14-year-old that is pregnant? What obligation do they have to this 14-year-old that is pregnant?
I just want to acknowledge that our fellow panelist has mentioned that with all the information and the education and the power that she has not reported an incident that occurred to her. In doing that, I want us to also be mindful that as we are talking about, young girls, we are talking about people who who should be enjoying life, who should be dreaming about what they want to be. Psychologically, teenagers are in a stage where they are formulating their identity. They should be curious about their body parts, and they've got these hormonal imbalances that sometimes are exciting. If they are boys, they are having wet dreams, etc., etc. I mean, if they are girls, they are having their first menstruation. So this is a very volatile time period to a young girl's mind, right? And physiologically, there are a lot of things. I mean, the boobies are starting, to form. So when these violations take place, they shatter their world, you know. And I think one of the things that we need to always be mindful of, therefore, is not to even, as health workers or as activists, is to recognize that vulnerability and recognize that violation for what it is, not for what we make,
Yeah.
right? Not for what we are saying. Like I'm using my colleague's, example. She's saying, what's the point into that system? I mean, she can pick up a phone and call certain people. She's highly privileged, but she's showing us in real time as we talk about the girls how difficult it is for a young woman or for an adult woman of privilege, of high education, of high standing in society. That should tell us how difficult it must be for the girl child, who probably is going to get confused, who probably is going to feel that, it's my fault, who's going to be feeling violated, even at the level of the family blaming her. What did you do? What were you wearing? Etc. Etc. So our work, therefore, is sometimes life and death for those young girls. So something as simple as saying it's not your fault, because the adults should know better all the time in these situations, right? So we need to simplify it and say something that is age appropriate for the girl child, to say, listen, it was not your fault. You are not to blame. The adult one is at fault. So you've got to concretize and being mindful that this person still may want to still go to school, may feel undesirable as a friend, may feel to blame and isolate and feel that, okay, maybe now I can't be that astronaut that I wanted to become, or that lawyer or that doctor I wanted. So you've got to make it a point that in the entirety of their functioning, they don't blame themselves. You need to remove the guilt, you need to remove the shame, and you can hear that this is the mouthful, but I'm trying to concretize it to say, sometimes even as activists and as health professionals, we miss the younger ones. I mean, it's not easy to work with kids. It's not easy to work with children, but a lot of the work has to be done there, even before the rapes happen. Even before the rapes happen, we need to give them so much empowerment. We need to make sure that we have enough time with them so that they know that they are worthy. It's even worse when they are victims now of rape. We've got to do so much repair work that is age appropriate, that is simple. If we fail at anything, we need to remove the shame and the guilt. And we need to be concrete about saying it was not your fault. So that's what I would say we all have to do, bearing in mind how confusing it must be for them. And again, think about this, because sex gets weaponized in rape. A lot of rape victims, they struggle with intimacy moving forward. They struggle receiving love and affirmation moving forward. So it's an ongoing, sort of process. But what is most important, we need to concretize for the girl children to make sense to them, and making sure that they know that it's not their fault. The adult is the one who should have protected them, who should not have taken advantage of them. So if all else fails, that's what we need to achieve as adults.
Thank you. We all have a responsibility. And as you are speaking, Mthetho, it's like I'm having a replay of a number, maybe few incidences where I also myself now am thinking in hindsight, I should have done something. I should have acted differently. I should have said something. Because sometimes we think that these situations are unique. It just so happens that it happens to a number of women and girls. We just don't know each other. But it's not a unique situation that we come across. And as older as we grow, it becomes normalized, especially in a setup where it's a marital setup. Sometimes you can't even go to, oh, Mama Zala, and, say something about a violation. They'll be saying like, "Patarakbet," because our elders only know that the only violence should be physical, to be in the form of an assault. Nothing that has to do with sexual violence or, molestation, anything related to that. But thank you for really opening our eyes. We all have a responsibility. We all have a responsibility. Um, Sis Coco, back to you. So, as a community, how should we support girls who have been raped and are pregnant?
So I recently did research, and I speak largely in my research about how oftentimes the woman experience or the girl experience is deduced to a shameful experience. And I think that speaks to just how you would then be, or how your perception changes in the community when an instance like this happens. So instead of the person who's violated you being the one who's shamed because they have committed such a bad, atrocious deed, the person who's been on the receiving end of the violation is then shamed. So I think firstly, a lot of narrative work needs to be changed, and the conceptual work just of the woman's experience needs to be changed. So you'll find that abortion stigma is very large in communities, particularly in underprivileged communities in your townships. And so when a girl child or a young lady or a woman falls pregnant, they are unable to get an abortion. But with this incongruent logic, they are still shamed for being pregnant according to a specific circumstance or reality, either because they are unmarried or because they are still in school, all these things, which I think, again, the bigger issue is that it is just directed towards the person who's at the receiving end of the violation and not the person who's perpetuating it. And like Mthetho speaks about, he explains it so well about the institutions who are often legitimate in communities perpetuate these or perpetuate this violence. The church that people identify with and want to be associated with and assimilate with will oftentimes perpetuate these acts of violence by continuing the stigma or furthering shame. So I think, in essence, we need to change the narrative and sort of the where we are looking at, and that also just speaks to justice recourse. So if we are to have the legal framework or the legal institution support these victims, it allows for these victims to come back into the community better and empowered from the situation that they were violated in to be able to assimilate. But secondly, I think if there is narrative work that is changed and communities go into a space where they understand that there is a perpetrator and a victim and not necessarily just a victim, because that's the sort of the ideals that are pushed, that the victim is the person that is highlighted, the victim is the person that is spoken about, the victim, where there is a perpetrator on the other end that has done this atrocious act, then we sort of change the narrative and we understand that this is something that has happened to a human being, and therefore they should be allowed the opportunity to come back into society and assimilate. So I think largely, really, how these victims or girls who have experienced this should be able to come back into the community is by the understanding that this has happened to them and they didn't ask for it, or it's not something that they stood out there waiting for it to happen to them. And then once that conceptual work is fixed and clarified and the narrative is changed, then assimilating into the community is better. And the legal institution allowing these people to get back their power. And I think last and most importantly, comprehensive sexual education. So in an instance where young girls are given the power to be taught better, they are able to make better decision in this regard. And I understand that there's obviously different cases that we're looking at. We're looking at a 14-year-old who has been violated, and we're also juxtapositionally looking at a 19-year-old who has engaged in sexual activity and has now fallen pregnant. So these are, all the conversations that we should be looking at. And I think most importantly, an intersectional approach. I think oftentimes we just want to blanket out this entire conversation and we disregard that we're not speaking about girls as a concept, but we're speaking about people's lived experiences. And so we should be able to put a name to the experience. It's either a black 14-year-old girl or a black disabled 14-year-old girl, because then solutions are better put together if we understand that it's a black 14 disabled girl child. We're able to understand that in the instance where we need to look at legal recourse, we understand that language is a factor. If it's the disability is being deaf or being blind, we're able to look at the crux of how the issue can be better solved, and therefore also come up with sort of ways in which these people can be better accommodated for in the community. Because, for instance, a disabled girl that is now fallen pregnant would need huge or greater amount of support. If the disabled girl child is in a wheelchair, for instance, they need a greater amount of support than a girl child who is on their 2 feet and is better able. So these are very important things. And most importantly, I think at the top of my list would be a changing of the narrative.
Sure, thank you. So, Andis, I'll bring you, Andis, I'll bring you on this one. It's because we all, Ugogo's just mentioned, girls with disabilities there. So, how is the experience with deaf girls? Let me put it like that. Are health facilities and police stations equipped to provide the necessary support? If not, what are these barriers or what are their barriers?
I mean, the barrier number one is communication, and one way of solving these is when nurses, doctors, police, whatever profession, while they're studying, to incorporate sign language as one of a must, even if it's just basic communication, so that people are not wrongfully diagnosed, for example. So the biggest factor is communication. And I've just last week, there's a teenage girl who didn't want the baby and wants to give the baby away, but is being told, not in her language, that it's bad, it's what you have to do. So again, the judgment of, you are deaf and you are pregnant and you're in school, what business do you have in opening your legs? And that is just the language that is being used around her. And with ugly gestures of pointing and doing this and angry expressions, the teacher claims that they are in a relationship. So there's just so many factors that nothing is happening. But one thing that we can influence is when you are studying for a certain profession, especially in a public sector, that sign language is included, so that we avoid such things. So that even if she wasn't a teenager, She knows that it's okay to give up a baby for adoption if that is a choice. Just basic knowledge, basic information. When we're shooting videos that have information about anything, let's include sign language and take it out there. That is one of the things that we can do within our powers. When we are speaking, let's not speak and othering the disability. Let's include, when we're saying International Day for the Girl, that includes everybody, brown, yellow, with a disability, without a disability. That's everybody. And it can start with us, it can start with people who are listening, it can start with us sharing, and biggie by biggie, we might make a difference. And yeah, because and every time I speak about this, I hear my voice, and it's very hopeless. It's very dark, and it's like iskala kuphi, maybe in the darkness where we are as the country, we can just start. This is one way of starting this webinar, and we can pass it over, to more other platforms where information can be shared.
Okay, you're mentioning other platforms. Interesting. Curious, Linji, I want to find out of the many cases that you've dealt with, have you perhaps received a positive feedback, maybe for example, where a particular health facility was, positively responsive in terms of wanting to learn or know the language or assist even, whether be it at a facility or a police station?
Uh, Unfortunately, not.
Oh,
Not without a fight. Not without you throwing your toys, threatening to sue people, and only then. Because the attitude is, first of all, yo, hi, gay, a deaf person. How did you even arrive at this point? When you go
sure.
to private hospitals, it is very settled, but it's the tone is there. Police, it's even worse. It's like, if you're trying to make sense, if you're trying to negotiate with the security guard that you want to pass, and it umthetho uthi, and you can't pass that, you can't pass beyond umthetho uthi sisi siyavala.
Oh, my
So,
goodness.
I mean, we're laughing about it because, hey, but the situation is that bad, including the departments, including Department of Health as the entire department, including bodies of HIV and AIDS, GBV. In general, there's a certain mind shift that has to happen. And I get that at some point it's ignorant, but at some point we need to move beyond that, where we are willing to learn and hear from a deaf girl, a deaf woman, a deaf mother, or a hearing mother raising a deaf child, in terms of how best do we assist you, so we hear it from first-hand experience, that this is how I want to receive help. This is how I want to receive information. So unfortunately, not. Yeah, the percentage of well being received or positive response. No, I mean, we're talking, their teachers were still at school teaching, and there's a little girl who's being abused, and the system is still continuing, and there's nothing that one can do.
Oh, all right. We'll take another round of questions. Remember to use the hashtag the girl day of the girl hashtag IDG 2022. So we have a question from Ushumela Dlali. Ushumela says, What do we do if the kids don't want to be helped? We have a case of a young girl. She's cohabiting with this older guy. She even dropped out of school. She was doing grade 8. And she's told her parents to stop coming to that place that she's staying, or she's staying rather, where she's staying at with the guy. But Mthetho, how do we address this?
Look, I mean, it's difficult. I think one of the things that is an unfortunate, unintended consequence of the 1994 project in South Africa is that as people, we abdicated our responsibilities. I mean, if you think about street committees, every street was responsible for whatever was happening on the streets. We know who the rapists are. We know who are the people who are taking advantage of the of learners at school. You know what I mean? So communities, I mean, I was having a conversation with my own family about a music teacher in a former high school that I attended, who I knew being in Joburg that actually this guy was taking advantage of the girl choristers. I mean, they were older, they were like above the consenting age, but it was not acceptable in terms of the laws of the school for a teacher or somebody of authority to sleep with a girl. So, like you know, since Gugulethu was saying, you can't talk about the victims and not talk about the perpetrator. So communities, I feel communities are expecting, Soul City or UN Women or the government to do 1, 2, and 3 and not take responsibility for what is happening in their community. So one of the things that we need to do, like, is to think about how we reorganize ourselves. I mean, at the moment, right now in South Africa, there's been a mushrooming of community policing forum, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but those police forums, they've actually been violent, killing whoever is the perpetrator and taking the law into their own hands. I don't blame them without understanding and appreciating their frustration. No, I'm not. At the same time, I'm not condemning or condemning them. I'm just reflecting that we need to do a lot more than just reacting when there's been a violation. So we've got to figure out that it's in our interest to take care of our street. It's in our interest to get involved in a school where our kids are going. It's in our interest to get involved and get our hands dirty. It's our school. It's not the Department of Education school. It's our school that is administered by government, but it's our kids who are in that school. So until we take responsibility, you know, I feel the picture, Andiswa, is looking gloomy, largely because of the refusal of the communities to take responsibility. And unfortunately, even in our own families, if I'm Mthetho, I'm this person who works and I'm the one who has raped, and then you find that it's gonna be no, like we are the uncle, you know, cannot be held accountable. So unfortunately, we've got to do that. Like, and we also the police are not there to do intando yabo. They are there to protect and serve us. But to the extent that we are not going to have a community policing forum that works in partnership with the police station and actually takes charge of what is happening. I mean, some young girls, they get raped, you know, they are given access, for instance, in shipins and taverns. We know that 14-year-olds are going to taverns. We have a case in Scenery Park where 21 young people died. And we have realized that a lot of them were actually underage in terms of the law. So a law was broken. Why was alcohol being sold to them? But that community knows about that, right? So unfortunately, we can do so much. Communities need to take charge of what is happening in their communities. They can do that by taking charge of their street, organize themselves and say, okay, on the streets, we are not going to allow people to be rapists and then still live in this community. So again, it depends on what we deem to be a priority. South Africans, by the way, we are very organized on things that matter to us. Just look at how many of us go to a Chisanyama every weekend. When we want a groove, we are very organized. I can't fathom why people think that activism has to be done by people who are employed in NGOs. You know what I mean? It's in our interest to keep our streets safe. It's in our interest to make sure that the shipins and the taverns don't sell alcohol to underage girls. It's in our interest to make sure that we patrol our streets. So working with boys and men, I always encourage Amachita who care to say, okay, there are things that you can do. Why not patrol the streets over the weekend? Make sure that whoever comes from the shipping or from the tavern at least goes home safe. But I mean, this is dirty work. It's work that is activism that doesn't come with a lot of prestige. You know, you don't get rewarded for it. So people don't want to do it. But then they are the first to complain. So, I mean, until we change our mindset as communities and take charge of our streets.
Sure. On the same breath, any supportive interventions that you can make mention of to help the family of the victim or the survivor, because this does not only affect the survivor of rape. So we're looking at, going back to the question I asked Gugu earlier of the 14-year-old, are there any supportive interventions that are available for a survivor of either rape or, sexual violation that would be offered to the family?
Look, I mean, families often blame themselves, when their child, has been violated, even parents, they blame themselves. Like I said, with the girl child who's been violated, who's been raped, it's also important for families to know that sometimes you can do the best you can do as a parent, only to find out your child gets raped. And it's important that families are supported and are given space to, to deal with the trauma, and the blame again is you remove the blame, especially where there is clearly nothing that they could have done to predict that. I mean, like for instance, if you take your child to school and then your child is violated by a trusted teacher, there's no way of anticipating that as a family, because you would assume that the adults at school, they are doing everything in terms of the law. But for me, what is important also, as much as we may be lamenting, our government is doing what it can. I mean, the social development is inundated with so much responsibility. I do know that the government is easy to blame oftentimes, but I know that the social development is there for people to reach out. They've got social workers. It's always good that even if you don't know where to go to your clinic. If you can go to your clinic and then you can report the case or you can report the situation and ask to be referred to a social worker. I mean, there are amazing organizations that I've seen across the country as well. I mean, I know in Gugulethu, for instance, there's an organization called Ilita Labantu, and there's also another organization called Lumkile's Book Joint. The same way you will find that in Soweto, you've got a group of men in prayer. So it's not all doom and gloom. I think it looks doom and gloom because we as the people are not taking full responsibility to make sure that we are not going to have rapists living amongst us, and we, we become a haven of rapists. I mean, we also know that as men, I also say as men, if we were to take responsibility as a machita and isolate rapists, there wouldn't be a rapist in South Africa. Trust me, if as men were to wake up and say, okay, if you are my friend and you have raped, you are no longer my friend. Or if you are my friend or you are in my church and you have raped, you are not going to be accepted in my church. Or if you are my friend and then you rape, you're not and you are into young girls and you are taking advantage of young girls, then you're not going to be amongst us, in our traditional cultural feast or a sontoing in our church. But it's just that as men, we don't do that because we don't think it's our responsibility to get involved in dealing with rape. And yet, as men, we understand that white people are the ones who must stop white supremacy and racism. But somewhat, as men, we don't understand the same dynamic to say it's going to take us as men to get involved as well in isolating rapists. I'm not advocating for any violent treatment of people who are found to be rapists. I'm just talking about us isolating them, because trust me, we know who the rapists are as men. They are our friend, they are our brothers, they are our sons, it's us. So until we isolate them and until we assume a responsible sense that says, okay, cool, when women are like angry at men or at rapists, they don't say some men rape, they say men are trash and all that. And then we get upset. That's fine, we can get upset, but what are we doing? As men, we need to organize ourselves and say, how do we make our streets safe so that when young girls see me as Mthetho or Uncle Mthetho around the community, they feel safe? We can do that. There are men who are organizing themselves to do that. You know what I mean? So I suppose everyone has to play their role. I suppose as communities, as members of the public, we also need to stop abdicating our responsibility and have all these expectations from government and not do anything. We need to demonstrate what is it that we are doing. And I'm arguing that we can organize ourselves on the streets. How do we take care of the people who live on the street? We can do that.
Wow. You've answered even the last question I had for you. Therefore, I'm not even going to ask it, rather. Sis Gugu, quickly, what interventions are there to empower young people?
Okay, so I think firstly it's recognizing structurally what power has been given to certain people in said society. So in this instance, men, boys, and then the structural divide between the men, girls, and the men, boys, and then the divide that exists then with the woman. I think that's the first point of departure that I would speak about. So in the case of Shumela, who was asking what they would do, in that instance, it's very easy. You call the cops on the man who's the perpetrator or the man that is living with that child, because you have been able to understand that there's a structural divide in power in that particular instance. The 14-year-old does not want to listen, but this isn't a case of reprimanding a 14-year-old, but removing them away from a position that is harmful for them. So I think acknowledging and recognizing structural power divides, that's very important. And two, I think it's empowering girl children from a very primitive age. So if girl children are taught from a very young age, to have their power, whether it's through comprehensive sexual education or whether it's through teaching them narratives that aren't taught now. So now we're teaching girl children that they are the prize, that they are getting prepared to be married. Those little narrative changes make a big difference in the long run. But I think lastly and most importantly, raising human beings and not necessarily girl children or boy children, because in that case, we afford human beings a great amount of power and the ability to recognize that they're deserving and worthy of their rights. So, in an instance where we can recognize girl, children, women, young ladies as human beings before any other chosen identity, then we ultimately are a step ahead. We are affording everyone their rights. We are teaching people on the same playing field in schools. When we have ALO, when we're teaching sexual education, everyone is being taught about their body. Everyone is being taught what their body does. Everyone is being taught that they can say yes and they can say no. That sort of grounding work is most important. But from a radical perspective, because I do identify from radicalness, I think from the grassroots, understanding that a lot of these things are very systemic. Even patriarchy in and of itself, it's a system that was in and of itself enforced upon men in order for men to be able to carry out that institution. And so we need to change and dismantle that system from the very grassroots of it and foundationally. So we absolutely need to let everything burn so that we can start all over again and build new systems that will advocate for girl children and human beings at large rather.
Sure, thank you. And lastly, for Andiswa, for the deaf community, what do you think, or what do we want to see rather happening to effect systemic change?
I think more awareness, more willingness to be taught how a person who uses sign language wants to be helped, and educating ourselves more and more, and be willing to unlearn the things that we people of hearing privilege, because there's the man boy privilege, and then on top of that there's the hearing privilege. So if we can just be willing to learn and not do a ticking a box exercise, we will change lives.
Sure. Thank you so much. Time flies and we had so much have to talk about. But thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Mthetho. Thank you, Sis Andiswa. Thank you, Sis Cook. I believe we have learned a lot. This has been a great platform for, I believe, every one of us, even those of us who are tuning in online. And really, I believe more platforms of this nature, of this fashion, would really help us to unpack so much, because I believe there's a lot to still unpack. Because of time, I'd like to thank you for joining us on this webinar. Thank you to everyone that had participated, the questions that were coming through. We really appreciate your time. We really appreciate your engagement. You're also welcome to continue asking questions even beyond this live conversation, and you will definitely be answered. Thank you to the UNFPA for their continued support on this project. I believe that we can continue to change the lives of so many people, one conversation at a time. Thank you so much for coming into this platform. We really appreciate it. Have a lovely afternoon, evening further. Goodbye.
Thank you for having us. Bye.